Emma sat on the worn-out couch in the small house she shared with her husband, Lucas, her hand trembling over her belly that was just beginning to show the first signs of pregnancy. She had just discovered she was pregnant, and, like any woman, what she wanted most at that moment was to share this news with the person she loved. But Lucas hadn't come home in days. He had already become a stranger, leaving for work and disappearing for hours without explanation. Emma always knew their relationship was deteriorating, but she never imagined it was about to crumble so brutally. The phone rang, and she rushed to answer it, hoping to hear Lucas's voice. "Hello," she said, her voice anxious. On the other end of the line, she heard a woman's laugh. Emma's heart stopped. "Lucas is with me. Don't look for him anymore. He's made his choice," the woman said coldly. The call ended. Emma stood there, motionless, the phone still in her hand. Tears silently rolled down her face. This wasn't possible. This wasn't what she expected when she married Lucas, the man who swore to be by her side, in sickness and in health. Now, alone with the news that she was carrying a child, she had to make a difficult decision. Over the next few days, Lucas didn't show up, didn't call. There were no explanations, no goodbyes. Emma knew what this meant. He had left, never to return. Each morning she woke up, the emptiness on the bed beside her became heavier. But something was growing inside Emma, not just the life of the child she was carrying, but also a silent determination. She knew she couldn't wait any longer for someone who had abandoned her when she needed him most. It was time to be strong. The child to come would need everything from her, and Emma promised herself she wouldn't fail. And so began Emma's new life, a journey of loneliness, pain, and sacrifice. Without higher education, and with no one she could trust, Emma began looking for work. The only offer she got was for housekeeping, cleaning homes of wealthy families who barely noticed her presence, except when the shine of the furniture or the spotless floor pleased them. Emma, who once dreamed of a life of comfort and stability with Lucas, now spent entire days on her knees, scrubbing cold floors while feeling her child move inside her. The work was exhausting, and the money barely covered the essentials. Days passed, and Emma, increasingly tired, prepared to be a single mother. She had no choice but to continue, swallowing her pride, pain, and anguish of being abandoned by the man who promised to love her. And so, while the families she worked for smiled and planned luxurious dinners, Emma struggled to save every penny, preparing to bring into the world the only thing that still gave her strength, Brian, her son. Part February 9th, Brian's birth. Months had passed since Emma received that call that changed her life. Her belly was already big, and each day seemed more difficult. Winter was approaching, and the city of Sao Paulo, with its noisy and busy streets, seemed even colder. Emma barely had enough to cover expenses for food and rent, but she was determined not to let anything be lacking for the son who was about to be born. It was a Friday morning. Emma had just finished cleaning one of the most elegant houses in the neighborhood when she felt an intense pain in her belly. The pain was sharp, unlike anything she had ever felt before. She put aside the bucket and mop, leaning against the wall. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and her heart raced as she realized this might be the moment. She hurried, doing what she could to reach the nearest hospital. The journey seemed endless. With each step, the pain increased, but Emma kept going, determined. There was no one to help her. Her world was reduced to loneliness and struggle, and now, to the fear of the unknown. Upon arriving at the hospital, the attendants noticed her condition and quickly took her inside. Emma, breathless, tried to control her breathing as she was placed on a stretcher. "Breathe deeply. Everything will be all right," said the nurse in a comforting tone, but Emma knew that from then on, everything would depend only on her. The hours that followed were agonizing. Emma, exhausted, struggled to stay conscious between the pains of contractions. She never imagined that giving birth would be so painful, but at the same time, she knew this was the beginning of something greater. Something she had promised herself, that she would make any sacrifice for the child who was about to be born. Finally, after a long and painful labor, a baby's cry echoed through the room. Emma, with tears in her eyes, reached out to hold little Brian for the first time. He was so fragile, with closed eyes and pink skin. The nurse placed him in her arms, and Emma, overcome with a mixture of relief and emotion, pressed him against her chest. "You're all I have," she whispered, caressing Brian's little head. "I promise I'll never leave you, no matter what happens." In the days that followed, Emma remained in the hospital, recovering while trying to adapt to the new reality of being a mother. Every time she looked at little Brian, she felt a wave of love mixed with a deep sense of responsibility. There was no more room for weakness. She needed to be strong, not for herself, but for him. When she was finally discharged, Emma returned to the small apartment she called home. The place was cramped, and the cold of the walls seemed to penetrate her bones. However, there was something different now. Brian's presence brought warmth, a reason to continue, even when everything seemed difficult. Emma quickly realized that the reality of raising a child alone would be much more challenging than she had imagined. The nights were long, with Brian crying from hunger or discomfort. She spent hours trying to calm him, even when her own body begged for rest. Money remained scarce, and with each trip to the market, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The little savings she had soon began to disappear, and Emma found herself forced to accept more houses to clean, working to exhaustion. While cleaning windows and scrubbing bathrooms, Emma thought about how other families had everything she had dreamed of: a comfortable home, financial security, support. But at the same time, she knew that little Brian was the reason she endured all the hardships. Each of his smiles, though rare, was a reminder that it was all worth it. The years passed slowly for Emma. Brian was already 5 years old, and things remained difficult. The workdays were increasingly heavy, and Emma felt the effects of accumulated exhaustion in her body. She woke up before sunrise, made breakfast for Brian, a simple bread and weak coffee for her, a glass of milk for him, and then left him with a neighbor while she went to her first cleaning shift. Despite everything, Brian was a child full of life. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, and Emma did her best to ensure he didn't feel the weight of their difficult life. Whenever she returned from work, even exhausted, she tried to spend time with him, helping him with his first steps in reading and telling stories before bedtime. However, financial difficulties became more severe each month. The rent continued to increase, and Emma found herself forced to make sacrifices she could barely endure. On many days, she skipped meals to ensure Brian had at least one decent meal. The money she earned barely covered basic expenses, and hunger began to become a silent companion in her life. But Emma never complained, never showed her pain. For Brian, she always maintained a smile, hiding the true reality of what they were living. Her greatest fear was that he would grow up with the same resentment she carried from Lucas's abandonment, so she did everything possible to ensure he had a childhood, even if simple, full of affection. One of the worst moments came when Brian began to notice the difference between his life and that of other children. He sometimes came home with a sad look, asking why they didn't have a big house or why he couldn't have new toys like his school friends. These questions broke Emma's heart, but she always answered with patience and love. "One day, son, things will get better," she would say as she cuddled him in her lap. "I promise I'll do my best for you, always." Despite the promises and effort, Emma knew reality was relentless. With each passing year, it became harder to sustain hope for better days. Bills piled up, work hours increased, and her health began to show signs of failure. However, there was something that kept Emma going: Brian. One afternoon, while cleaning the floor of a luxurious house, Emma heard Brian running through the door. "Mom," he shouted, with a sparkle in his eyes that Emma hadn't seen in a long time. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and bent down to his level. "What is it, my love?" "At school, the teacher asked what we want to be when we grow up, and I said I want to be an airplane pilot." Emma smiled, although a pang of sadness hit her. Brian's dreams seemed so distant from the reality they lived, but she wouldn't be the one to extinguish that spark of hope. "You'll be the best airplane pilot in the world," she said, kissing his forehead. "I believe in you." Brian started talking about airplanes every day. He drew little planes in his notebooks, made engine noises while running around the room, and even invented stories where he flew big aircraft around the world. For Emma, seeing this passion bloom in Brian was the only thing that brought color to the gray days of her life. However, over time, Emma began to realize that Brian's dream was a way to escape the harsh reality they lived in. At 7 years old, he already understood that things weren't easy, and sometimes, before bed, he would ask Emma if they would ever have enough money for him to really fly. Emma always smiled and replied, "Don't worry, Brian. One day, you'll fly so high that you'll never have to worry about that again." Inside, however, Emma struggled with guilt and a sense of helplessness. How could she support such a grand dream when she could barely pay the rent? With each new difficulty, each late bill, Brian's dream seemed more distant, but she refused to let reality suffocate her son's hope. Even with the adversities, Brian kept dreaming. While Emma cleaned houses, he imagined the skies he would one day cross, unaware that his mother was sacrificing herself every day so that, at least, he would have the chance to dream. Brian had just turned 9, and Emma's life continued to be an endless cycle of struggles and sacrifices. Her days were long, cleaning luxury homes, while her nights were dedicated to caring for Brian and trying to hide the exhaustion that consumed her body. Sometimes, she felt like she was slowly disintegrating, but she couldn't stop. Every penny she earned was essential to ensure her son had a minimum of comfort. However, the financial situation worsened. Food prices were rising, and rent continued to pressure them. Each month, Emma found herself forced to choose what she could pay: electricity bills, food, or medicine. Often, dinner was a thin vegetable soup, stretched as much as possible to last several days. Even so, Emma always made sure Brian ate first, hiding her own hunger. Brian, on the other hand, grew increasingly aware of the difficulties they faced. He saw how much his mother worked, how her hands were rough and injured from years of cleaning, and how hard she tried to keep him from realizing how little they had. Gradually, the innocent questions about why they couldn't have a life like others became less frequent. He began to accept the reality they had, but something inside him never stopped dreaming. Despite the harsh reality, Brian remained firm in his dream of becoming a pilot. He spent hours studying about planes, reading everything he could find in the school library. On weekends, he went to the park with his mother, where he would watch the planes in the sky, pointing and saying, "One day, that'll be me up there, Mom." And Emma, even tired, always encouraged him, with a weary smile on her lips. One night, after a long day of work, Emma returned home exhausted. Her back ached, and every muscle seemed to scream for rest, but Brian was there, with a smile on his face, eager to share something important. "Mom, guess what? The school is organizing a field trip to the airport. I'm going to see the planes up close," he said, his eyes shining with excitement. Emma's heart sank. She knew how much Brian dreamed of seeing a real plane, but there was a problem: the cost of the trip. It was a small amount for many, but for Emma, it meant choosing between paying the water bill or fulfilling Brian's dream. She looked at her son, who was watching her full of expectation, and felt a pang of sadness. How could she tell him they couldn't afford it? "That's amazing, Brian," Emma said, trying to hide her concern. "I'll see how we can make it happen." That night, Emma sat at the table, staring at the bills. The field trip cost the equivalent of 2 days' work, and she didn't know how she would manage it. The money already set aside for basic expenses barely covered what they needed to survive until the end of the month. However, the thought of seeing Brian sad, once again having to deal with frustration, made her make a decision. In the following days, Emma started working more hours. She began accepting the toughest jobs, the heaviest cleaning tasks, and even weekend work, all to raise the necessary money. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Her hands, already calloused, were now injured, and her feet throbbed from walking so much from one house to another, but the thought of seeing the smile on Brian's face drove her on. Finally, after weeks of effort, Emma managed to gather the necessary money. When she handed Brian the envelope with the permission slip and payment for the field trip, he hugged her so tightly that Emma almost forgot all the fatigue. "I knew you'd do it, Mom," Thank you. Thank you, he said, his eyes full of gratitude. At that moment, Emma realized she would do anything to ensure her son could keep dreaming, even if it meant sacrificing everything of herself. On the day of the field trip, Brian left home earlier than usual. He was excited, wearing the nicest clothes he had, which Emma had ironed the night before. When the school bus arrived at the airport, Brian's eyes filled with wonder. The huge aircraft, the busy runways, and the sound of engines were everything he had always dreamed of seeing up close. The group was taken to see some restricted areas of the airport, where they could watch pilots preparing for flights and aircraft being refueled. Brian observed everything attentively, barely able to contain his excitement. When they reached the flight simulator, something inside him lit up. He knew at that exact moment that he didn't just want to dream about planes, he wanted to be up there controlling them. Upon returning home, Brian ran to tell Emma everything he had seen and learned. His excitement was so contagious that, for a moment, Emma forgot about all their difficulties. She allowed herself to believe, along with Brian, that a different future was possible. But reality was always there, ready to remind her of the limits imposed by the life they led. You're going to be a great pilot, Brian. And when you're up there, flying through the skies, I'll be down here, cheering you on, Emma said, smiling. Brian, with eyes full of determination, replied, I promise, Mom. And the first time you ride in a plane, it'll be with me. Emma laughed softly, but something in her heart warmed. She didn't know if she would live to see this dream realized, but the certainty that Brian believed with all his soul made her believe too. The years marched on relentlessly, and Emma's life became a true marathon of sacrifices. Brian was now 14, a teenager full of dreams, but already aware of the limitations life imposed on them. He was intelligent, studious, and his grades were always the best in school. However, each of Brian's achievements came with a price that Emma paid in silence. Emma's work had become unbearable. Her body, already punished by years of heavy cleaning, was beginning to show signs that it couldn't take much more. She had constant back pain, her knees complained with every movement, and her hands, covered in scars and cracks, were a reflection of everything she had endured over the years. Even so, she continued, the nights were the hardest. While Brian slept in the small bedroom, Emma spent hours awake, dealing with insomnia and worries. Rent, bills, food, everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. She did her best to hide her concerns from Brian, but he was no longer the little boy she could protect from life's realities. Brian noticed everything. He saw how much his mother sacrificed, how much she suffered to keep them afloat, and it made him feel a mixture of gratitude and helplessness. He knew that his dream of becoming a pilot seemed increasingly distant, but he didn't want to let his mother know that he too felt the weight of reality. Brian had started looking for ways to help, offering to do small jobs in the neighborhood, like washing cars and delivering newspapers, but Emma always discouraged him. You need to focus on your studies, Brian. Your future depends on it, she would say firmly, but with a tenderness that only a mother could have. One night, however, Brian came home and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her face in her hands, in complete silence. It was an unusual scene. Normally, Emma did her best to hide her exhaustion and sadness, but something that day had broken her strength. Brian approached slowly, sitting down beside her. Mom, what happened? He asked, worried. Emma took a few seconds to respond. When she finally raised her face, Brian saw the tears she was trying to hold back. I don't know what to do anymore, she confessed, her voice trembling. The bills are piling up and the money isn't enough. I'm working as much as I can, but it seems that no matter how hard I try, I can't keep up. I wanted to give you everything, Brian. I wanted you to have a better life, to be able to follow your dreams, but I'm failing you. Brian felt a tightness in his chest hearing that. Seeing his mother, who had always been the image of strength and resilience, break down like that was devastating. He knew how much she sacrificed for him and felt an immense desire to comfort her. You've never failed me, Mom, Brian said, holding her hands. Everything I am, everything I'll be, is because of you. You've already done more than anyone would do. Emma looked at her son, her eyes brimming with tears, and smiled slightly.
I just wish I could do more, Brian.
I wanted to give you the world, but it seems like all I can do is keep a roof over our heads. The conversation with Brian gave Emma a brief sense of relief, but the relentless reality didn't take long to return. In the days that followed, the bills continued to pile up, and Emma was forced to make a decision she had been avoiding for a long time: asking for help. She knew that knocking on the doors of friends or acquaintances to ask for money was something she didn't want to do, but circumstances had become unsustainable. However, pride and shame held her back. Then one day, while cleaning one of the houses, one of her employers, a middle-aged man named Mr. Martinez, found her kneeling, scrubbing the floor and visibly exhausted. "Emma, are you all right?" he asked with a concerned expression. She tried to smile, but fatigue and despair prevented her from disguising it. "Yes, sir. Just a little tired," she replied as she stood up with difficulty. Mr. Martinez looked at her sympathetically. He already knew that Emma was a hardworking woman, but something in her expression made him realize that things were getting worse. He hesitated for a moment, but decided to ask, "Emma, if you need anything, you can tell me. I know things aren't easy for you." Shame overtook her, and Emma immediately shook her head.
"No, sir. I'm fine."
But Mr. Martinez insisted. He saw Emma's injured hands, the signs of extreme fatigue on her face, and knew she was at her limit. "Listen, Emma, you've worked here for years, and I trust you. If you need an advance or anything else, don't hesitate to ask me. I know you have a son, and if I can help, I'll be happy to do so." The employer's words hit Emma like a punch. She felt tears fill her eyes, but fought to maintain her composure. She thanked him humbly, refusing the advance, but deep down, she knew she might need to accept this offer soon. At home, Brian continued to study hard. He knew his grades could be the key to a scholarship and thus fulfill his dream of becoming a pilot. Every time he saw his mother struggle, he felt he needed to do more, study more, be the best. For him, it wasn't just about fulfilling a personal goal, but honoring the sacrifices Emma made daily. One night, after a long day, Emma and Brian were sitting at the table, talking about school. Brian mentioned something that made Emma's heart race. At school, the science teacher talked about scholarship programs for those who want to pursue a career as a pilot. He said that with good grades, I can try. "This could change everything, Mom," Brian said excitedly. Looking into her son's eyes, Emma saw a light she couldn't extinguish. She knew the path would be arduous, but at that moment, a flame of hope rekindled within her. Brian's dream was now the only thing that mattered. In the years that followed, Emma plunged headfirst into the silent sacrifice that had become her life. Brian, now 17, was in his last year of high school and ever closer to realizing his dream of becoming a pilot. He excelled in his classes, especially in math and science, essential subjects for anyone wanting to enter the world of aviation. The hours dedicated to studying were not in vain, and the possibilities of scholarships seemed more real with each passing day. Emma, on the other hand, lived an increasingly harsh reality. The cleaning work, which was already exhausting, became even more demanding. She had accepted more shifts and started working in 2 houses a day, barely stopping to rest. Her back ached constantly, and the pain in her joints intensified, but Emma kept a smile on her face for Brian. What she could no longer hide was the extreme fatigue that took over her body. The deep dark circles under her eyes and her dragging steps were signs that something was wrong, but she never complained. Brian, however, noticed. He saw his mother wear down a little more each day. Many times, he came home from school and found Emma asleep on the couch, still dressed in her cleaning uniform, without even having the strength to prepare dinner. In these moments, he wondered if it was worth continuing with the dream of being a pilot, knowing that the sacrifice his mother made was getting bigger. One night, as Emma washed the dishes with trembling hands, Brian decided to talk. "Mom, don't you think you're working too hard? I can see how it's affecting you." Emma stopped, leaving the dishes in the sink, and turned to her son. She smiled, but the smile was sad. "I'm fine, Brian. Just a little tired, as always. Nothing I can't handle." Brian approached and held his mother's hands. You've already done so much for me. I feel like you're wearing yourself out, and I don't want that to happen. If necessary, I can let go of this dream." Emma felt a tightness in her chest hearing that. Her eyes filled with tears. The idea that Brian was considering giving up on his dream after so many years of struggle was unbearable. She quickly wiped away the tears and looked deep into her son's eyes. "Brian, listen to me," she said firmly. "What I do for you, and I would do it all over again if I had to. Your dream is what keeps me going, what gives me strength to continue. I've sacrificed a lot, but I'll never let you give up on what you want. We'll get there, and I'll see you piloting a plane, even if it's the last thing I do." Brian hugged his mother tightly, feeling the pain and love in her words. He knew he couldn't give up, not now, not after everything they had faced together. In the months that followed, Brian began to prepare intensely for the exams that would guarantee him the chance to get a scholarship. He spent hours locked in his room, reviewing every detail, while Emma continued her daily journey of exhausting work. However, something changed. Emma began to feel more intense pain in her back and knees, and the sharp pains became constant. On many days, she found herself forced to stop in the middle of a task to rest, something she had never done before. But even with her body giving clear signs that it was at its limit, Emma refused to slow down. She knew that if she stopped, the bills wouldn't be paid, and Brian's dream could be lost. One morning, as she got up to go to work, Emma felt such a sharp pain in her back that she fell to her knees on the kitchen floor. Her body wasn't responding, and she couldn't get up. Despair took over for a few seconds, but she took a deep breath, trying to control the panic. Brian was in his room, still sleeping. She didn't want him to see her like this. She crawled to the wall, using the counter for support, and with great effort, managed to stand up. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned on the sink, trying to regain her strength. Her body screamed for rest, but Emma knew there was no choice. Taking a deep breath, she wiped away the tears and, even with difficulty, put on her cleaning uniform and left the house. As always, she pretended everything was fine. Throughout the day, the pain in her back intensified. Every movement was a huge effort, and Emma had to sit down several times to recover. The other maids in the house noticed her condition and suggested she go to the doctor, but Emma just shook her head, refusing. "I can't stop," she said, repeating it more to herself than to others. However, Emma's body had its limits. The following week, after another exhausting day of work, she fainted in one of the houses where she worked. The shock was enormous. The employers, worried, immediately took her to the hospital. Brian was notified and rushed there as soon as he found out. At the hospital, while waiting for news, Brian felt his heart tighten. He knew his mother had been sacrificing herself for years, but seeing Emma there, so vulnerable, made reality weigh on him in an unbearable way. When the doctor finally came out of the room with a worried expression, Brian quickly stood up. "How is she, doctor?" The doctor looked at Brian seriously. "Your mother has a severe spine injury. Her body is very worn out, probably from years of intense physical effort. She's going to need a lot of rest and treatment to recover. And, honestly, I don't recommend she continues with this type of work." Brian felt the world crumble around him. He knew that job was their only means of support. If Emma could no longer work, how would they survive? And more than that, he knew his mother would never accept stopping work, even if she was at her limit. When he finally entered the room to see Emma, the scene was painful. She was lying down, pale and with a tired expression, but when she saw Brian, she smiled, trying to hide the pain. "I'm fine, son," she said, her voice weak. "Just a little scare." Brian held her hand, squeezing it affectionately. "Mom, you need to rest. You can't go on like this." Emma looked at her son and, for the first time, didn't have a ready answer. She knew Brian was right, but she also knew that stopping work wasn't an option. Tears filled her eyes, but she held back. "We'll find a solution, Brian," she said, her voice choked. "Don't worry. I just need a little time." But deep down, they both knew the situation had reached a critical point. The days in the hospital dragged on like slow torture for Emma. Every movement was painful, and the frustration of not being able to work only increased. She knew that rest was essential for recovery, but the weight of bills piling up at home and Brian's uncertain future kept her in a constant state of anxiety. Even in the face of such gravity, Emma refused to accept that her body was giving out, and her greatest concern was not her own health, but what this meant for her son. Brian, on the other hand, carried a new burden on his shoulders. Seeing his mother in a hospital bed after so many years of sacrifice made him decide he would not let her dream of seeing him fly be destroyed. But for that, he needed to be strong and perhaps sacrifice something important. Every night, he returned from the hospital to an empty house, dealing with the reality that was approaching. They couldn't survive without Emma's income. The doctors were clear. Emma needed absolute rest and proper treatment, which included expensive medications and possibly surgery in the future. The cost of this was far beyond what they could afford. Brian knew that without this recovery, his mother would never be able to return to work, and the little they had to sustain the house would be consumed quickly. One night, while sitting beside Emma in the hospital, Brian decided it was time to talk about something he had been keeping to himself. "Mom," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot lately. Maybe I should postpone this whole pilot thing." Emma, who was lying down, slowly opened her eyes, looking at Brian. She knew those words didn't come from a place of weakness, but from love and concern. However, the idea of Brian giving up his dream, the only one she had fought so hard to keep alive, devastated her. "Brian, you can't do that," she said, her voice low but firm. "I sacrificed every part of me so you could dream. Giving up now, it wouldn't be fair to everything we've been through." Brian held his mother's hand. He had anticipated the resistance, but he was determined to do what was necessary to help her. "I know, Mom. I know how much you fought for me,
But you need help now.
I can work, find something. We need to survive." Brian's words hung in the air. Emma felt both pride and pain. She didn't want Brian to trade his dreams for the same sacrifices she had made throughout her life, but at the same time, she knew that without help, they were on the brink of financial collapse. After a long silence, Emma sighed. "I don't know what to do, Brian. I can't carry everything alone anymore, that's clear. But seeing you give up, that would kill me." Brian smiled slightly, wiping away the tears that threatened to fall. "I'm not giving up, Mom. Just postponing. Until you get better. We'll get through this together." In the following weeks, while Emma was still recovering in the hospital, Brian began looking for part-time jobs. He managed to get a position at a nearby diner, where he worked nights after school. The days became exhausting, with Brian dividing his time between studies, work, and hospital visits. He didn't complain, but the fatigue was visible. The teachers at school noticed the change. Brian, who was once the exemplary and always engaged student, now arrived with heavy eyes and a tired expression. Although his grades remained good, he barely had the energy to concentrate in class, and his studies for the Aviation Academy entrance exams began to fall by the wayside. One afternoon, his science teacher, Mrs. Regina, asked him to stay after class. "Brian, what's going on? You are one of my best students, but I've noticed you're not as present lately." Brian tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "My mom is sick, teacher. She can't work right now, so I'm helping out as much as I can." Mrs. Regina, a middle-aged woman who had always admired Brian's determination, felt a pang in her chest. She knew the boy had a bright future ahead, and that giving up now could cost him his dream of being a pilot. "Brian," she said softly, "I know life is tough right now, but you can't let your dreams go. You have a golden chance in your hands. And I know that your mom, no matter what she's going through, doesn't want you to give up." Brian lowered his head, feeling the weight of her words. He knew the teacher was right, but reality was cruel. How could he continue dreaming about the future when the present was crumbling? "I'll try, teacher. But things are complicated," he replied sincerely. She nodded, understanding the situation, but determined not to let Brian get lost. "If you need help, come to me. You're not alone in this, Brian." Meanwhile, in the hospital, Emma began to show signs of improvement. The back pain lessened with treatment, but she was still far from being fully recovered. Even so, her mind was fixed on one thing: ensuring Brian didn't give up on his dream. One day, she decided it was time to do something she had been avoiding for a while. With her phone in hand, Emma called Mr. Martins, the boss who had offered help weeks earlier. "Mr. Martins, I need to accept your offer. I can't keep going at this pace, and my son is sacrificing his future for me." Mr. Martins, who already knew about Emma's difficult situation, was direct. "Emma, I was waiting for your call. We can talk about how I can help you. And please, don't hesitate to ask. I know you would do the same for anyone." Emma sighed in relief, even though asking for help was a blow to her pride. "Thank you very much, sir. This means more than you can imagine." In the following days, Mr. Martins advanced part of Emma's salary and offered her a lighter job once she recovered. This money eased some of the burden on Brian's shoulders, allowing him to reduce his hours at the diner and dedicate more time to his studies. However, the struggle was far from over. Time was running out, and the aviation scholarship exam was getting closer. Brian, still divided between work and studies, knew that this would be his chance to change their lives forever, but the fear of failure consumed him. He needed to be strong for Emma, for himself, and for the future they both dreamed of. In moments of greatest despair, he remembered his mother's words: "You will fly so high that you'll never have to worry about this again." The days leading up to the aviation scholarship exam were the most intense in Brian's life. He divided his time between studies and work, trying to balance the enormous responsibility he felt. Emma, still recovering, had returned home but remained weak, needing help with the simplest tasks. Brian did his best to care for her while hiding his own fear of failure. The pressure was immense, and the weight of so many expectations began to affect him in ways he never imagined. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his studies, the voice of fear always whispered in his mind. What if I don't make it? What if all this is for nothing? The dream of being a pilot, which was once a spark of hope in the darkness, now seemed like a fragile flame, ready to be extinguished by the wind of circumstances. Emma, for her part, watched her son with pride and concern. She saw how Brian struggled, how he barely slept to keep up with everything, and knew he was carrying a burden greater than he should. She tried not to show it, but the pain in her body and the exhaustion from so many years of struggle also consumed her. Even so, her only concern was Brian's future. On the eve of the exam, Brian locked himself in his room, reviewing his books and notes one last time. The silence of the house was broken only by the sound of pages turning, while he tried to keep his focus. Emma, sitting on the living room sofa, looked at his bedroom door, feeling a mix of pride and guilt. She knew how much Brian had sacrificed for her, and now, more than ever, she wanted him to succeed. As Emma settled into her seat, she felt a mix of nervousness and joy. She had never been on an airplane before, and the idea of being up in the air scared her, but there was something deeply reassuring, knowing that her son was in control. She fastened her seatbelt and looked out the window, watching the airplane begin to move. Brian, already in the cockpit, prepared for the flight. He knew how much this moment meant, not just for him, but for his mother. As the engines began to roar, he picked up the radio and spoke. "Attention, passengers. This is your pilot, Brian, speaking. I would like to make a special mention to my mother, Emma, who is on board today. Mom, this flight is for you. You gave me wings, and now it's your turn to fly." Emma, hearing the message, couldn't hold back her tears. Her heart was overflowing with emotion. In that moment, all the pain, all the suffering she had endured over the years seemed worth it. The airplane began to move down the runway, and Emma felt the gentle tremor as the wheels left the ground. She looked out the window and saw the city growing smaller and smaller until the clouds took over the landscape. They were in the air. The wind cut through the silence, and Emma finally felt the freedom of being up high. She couldn't believe it. She was flying. The woman who had spent her life struggling on the ground, cleaning the houses of others, was now above it all, her heart full of pride and her soul light. For a few minutes, she closed her eyes and simply felt the moment. She thought of Lucas, the man who had abandoned her. She thought of every tear she had shed, every meal she had sacrificed so that Brian would have something to eat. And then, she remembered the words she had said to Brian so many times. "One day, you will fly so high that you will never have to worry again." She had kept her promise. He was flying, and she was there to witness it. The flight continued smoothly, and the time seemed to pass too quickly. When the airplane began its descent for landing, Emma felt a mix of nostalgia and accomplishment. As she touched the ground again, she knew that something inside her had changed forever. Brian had transformed her life into something much greater than any dream she could have had. When the airplane finally stopped and the passengers began to disembark, Brian went to where Emma was. He helped her stand up, and as they exited the aircraft, the gentle afternoon wind touched her face, like a caress of everything she had achieved. "Mom," Brian said, his eyes shining, "this is just the beginning. There's so much more for us to live." Emma smiled, feeling her heart light for the first time in many years. "I know, my son. And no matter what happens, I will always be by your side." They embraced there, in the middle of the airport, surrounded by the noise of the airplanes, but immersed in a silence filled with love and gratitude. Emma had finally reached the heights, not just by the skies she had crossed that day, but by the sun she had raised, by the dream they had realized together. The sacrifice, the pain, and the struggle were part of the journey, but in that moment, it was all worth it. The end. What did you think of the video? Are you enjoying the stories? Tell me in the comments.